next year was the beginning of a new era for the Central Band with the arrival of O'Dell Willis. Mr. Willis was from Kentucky and had spent several years as a pianist in a regional dance band, Bud Rice's Kentucky Nighthawks. He came off the road, got a degree from the University of Kentucky, and took the job as the band director at the high school in Harlan, Kentucky. He stayed there from 1930 to 1937. Little is known of his years there, but he evidently developed the band to an award-winning level of excellence. When he started at Central in the fall of 1937, the band had fallen to less than 40 members, but he rapidly began to develop the program.
When Mr. Willis came to Central High School in 1937, he, in just a few short years, turned what was just an ordinary program into a super program. Well, my name is Reba Inkelbarger Haynes. I went to Central High School from 37 to 41. I started out by playing in the orchestra under Mr. Willis. I think when he came, there were about 35 or 40 people in the band, and in about 4 short years, that number increased to 90. Everyone respected him. They wanted to be in the band because he brought excellence to the band.
Here's Mr. Willis's first Central Band, as shown in the 1938 Centralite. The band is still using the old capes, but is wearing white pants with a stripe.
This baritone player on the right is Walter Gerdine. He is the earliest performing member of the band that has been located. Mr. Gerdine also played in the band during the final year of Malcolm Morrison's tenure. He remembers that Mr. Morrison was very friendly and well-liked, but that the discipline of the group was a little lacking at times. He told me that things changed dramatically from the first day that Mr. Willis arrived. V.C. Adcock was at Central in the early 1940s. He later became a band director and considered Mr. Willis a lifelong mentor, friend, and colleague. Mr. Willis also began quickly to raise the musical standards of the organization.
Well, he told me one time he had tryouts after marching season the first year he came. He said they had 13 alto saxophones in the band. And he says about 8 or 9 of them bit the dust when he had tryouts.
There was no feeder program training the students before they arrived at Central.
No. And he started them as freshmen. O'Dell taught them from the very beginning and used this circle system. Here's the beat, and then you tapped your rhythm on this hand. And that was the Eastman method of teaching rhythm.
Mr. Willis also began expanding the instrumentation of the group by purchasing additional needed instruments and finding students to play them.
My friend Martha Cox understood that he was going to buy an oboe and a bassoon, and she said, I want to try it for the bassoon. Why don't you try it for the oboe? So I thought, why not? So I called him about it, and he said, okay, and he gave me the instrument and a book on how to. And since I'd played the clarinet, well, it wasn't too much of a changeover. Up until that time, there were no women. We were the first 2 women who were ever allowed into Central High School's band.
Mr. Willis truly understood the importance of publicizing the activities of his growing band program. Here is the first of many examples, a May 1938 Knoxville Journal entry announcing his first spring concert at Central. It includes the same photo we've seen from the annual that year, and even lists the program to be played by the orchestra and the band. The article also mentions his first trip with the band to the Rhododendron Festival in Asheville, North Carolina that June. This festival was a week-long event held each summer, and Knoxville businessman Ben Bowers had been funding the Knoxville High School band's participation at Asheville for several years. It is unknown whether he was a Central alumni or whether he was convinced that the up-and-coming band at Central was now worthy of representing Knoxville, but the end result was that in the summer of 1938 he funded Central's trip. Evidently eager to make an excellent showing, Mr. Willis gathered as many students as he could for the trip. He included some new students that had not marched that fall, and even added some alumni. Helen Harris said that her future husband Albert went on this trip, although he had graduated a year earlier. It is a credit to Mr. Willis's efforts and the high interest in the band that he put together a band of over 80 students for this trip.
Then the summertime came and Central High Band was given an invitation to come to the Rhododendron Festival held at Asheville, North Carolina. All expenses paid. And so, very kindly, Mr. Willis, along with his wife, invited the two band sponsors, who were Marge McDonald and Frances Wallace, Martha Cox and myself, to go. And what a time we had. We had parades to attend. We had parades for the men to march in. They had special dances and picnics and other activities for us, and it was a great week. While we were there at the Rhododendron Festival, we saw a band there from Elizabethton, and leading that band was not a drum major, but a drum majorette. And Mr. Willis got a group of us in the Landgren Hotel, which had a huge lobby. We were all sitting around, and he said, "What do you think about Central High School having drum majorettes?" Well, there wasn't a dissenting vote. Everybody was for it. So I went home. There was no such thing as a majorette teacher or instructor or even any equipment. So I just sawed off a broomstick and got out in the backyard and started marching back and forth and learning a little twirling from a neighbor. And so that's when women were first allowed to be majorettes.
Mr. Willis was quickly taking an active professional role among the small but growing number of East Tennessee band directors. In October 1938, 14 East Tennessee directors each brought several of their more accomplished players to Knoxville to rehearse and perform for the East Tennessee Education Association Conference. Called the East Tennessee High School Band, this group was probably the first professional collaboration of directors in the area. It directly led to the creation later that year of the East Tennessee School Band and Orchestra Association, which still holds similar events today.
The 38-39 band is still rather small, and the women who were learning to be majorettes and play oboe and bassoon are not yet shown. There is a bass clarinet, more sousaphones are appearing, and the band is proudly showing off two timpani in the front row.
How typical of a band director. Mr. Willis obviously wanted the timpani in the stands for this photo, but made the students take them out with the covers on to protect the drum heads. However, the biggest change is, finally there are real uniforms. They were military ROTC style uniforms with a deep red jacket and hat with black pants. The school had no funds for uniforms though, so Mr. Willis, as usual, had a solution, as explained by two later students, Bob Luttrell and V.C. Adcock.
I do remember this. I remember we bought the uniforms from the kids that were before us because this was a hand-me-down uniform, and I remember that. Okay. Somebody prior to me had worn it.
You had to buy your own uniform?
Oh, yes, yes. O'Dell told me who to call. He knew, and he said, "No, you'll have to pay him $5 for it."
The band had the uniforms in time for Mr. Willis's second marching season, as shown in this newspaper clipping from November 1938. The band would wear these uniforms, still student-owned, for the next 10 years. During that 1938-1939 year, the instrumental music directors of Eastern Tennessee formally organized the East Tennessee School Band and Orchestra Association, or ETSBOA. The first official function of this group was to sponsor a music festival. It was fully sanctioned by the State Music Educators Association and was thereby called the State Contest, even though it was really open only to East Tennessee groups. As seen in these clippings, The Central Band was one of only 10 groups to participate in the first festival in April 1939. Mr. Willis gave a pre-festival concert and charged 25 cents admission to help fund the trip. Held for many years in Johnson City at East Tennessee State University, the ETSBOA Festival featured concert performances by bands and orchestras, which were judged and given a rating. It was often called a contest, but was in reality a festival in that no winner was selected. Bands were given a rating from 1 to 5, with 1 designating superior. As with high school football programs, the performing groups were divided into classifications based on school size. Central was always in Class A, the category for larger schools. The judge that first year was Dr. Frank Simon, a former John Philip Sousa Band cornet soloist who was the band director at the Cincinnati Conservatory of Music. There were also opportunities for soloists and small ensembles to play for a rating. After the performances, all the groups participated in a parade through Johnson City to Roosevelt Stadium, where a few bands would give marching performances, and there was often a massed band performance by all participants. Admission charged for this evening event served as a fundraiser for the fledgling ETSBOA. At that first ETSBOA festival, Central received one of only 4 superior ratings awarded. This festival is still held in a modified format today, with similar plaques still given only to superior rated performances. Note that since the Fountain City community at the time was an unincorporated city rather than within Knoxville, Mr. Willis had the plaque engraved as the Central High School Band, Fountain City, Tennessee. The band also went back to Asheville that summer again for the Rhododendron Festival.
The 1939-1940 band is beginning to show the results of Mr. Willis's efforts with the students. The low brass includes 5 updated sousaphones, the band includes a few women, and the majorettes are finally shown.
Reba Haynes told me more about getting started.
We had no training. We just did a few things and marched and strutted. They liked for you to strut back then, so you had to rear back and strut, and they thought that was good. I did a little bit of gymnastics too. See, I did the back bend and...
So this is you?
That's me. There was no such thing as majorette boots. The girl that we saw from Elizabeth and had on long high top boots, and we couldn't find them anywhere, so we took riding boots and dyed them white. And this picture got me in trouble. My husband saw that picture and he thought, well, Enkelbarger, that's not too common a name. And so he went to my sister and said, is that your sister whose picture's in the paper? Said, yes. So he met me that summer.
This was your future husband?
And my future husband. So that picture did it right there.
Here's a color view of those first uniforms, as furnished by Bob Luttrell. Mr. Luttrell played clarinet for Mr. Willis from 1939 to 1943. He later had a son and granddaughter in the Central Band, and another grandson was in the percussion section as of fall 2005. He also has many memories of the band.
They didn't have any, to my knowledge, they didn't have any feeder programs.
Cool, they just were encouraging people to be in the
Right,
band.
joined the band. I had taken clarinet lessons prior to that. I played the clarinet. I had musical training before I went into the band here. Those formations, and that's one thing Mr. Willis was really a stickler for. I mean, he wanted everybody in line in the right place and everything. You know, he was very strict, and I think the kids appreciated that. He didn't allow any horsing around. He wanted you here in place on time, and he wanted you to pay attention to the music. He wanted you to learn the music, and he didn't want any horsing around on the field when we drilled. But no, he was a fair person, and I don't think the kids really appreciated him until they left, till they got out of school. Drum major, and I mean, I'm talking about that big, tall, fuzzy hat, and the big boom, 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 boom baton. And I mean, and strutting. We had some of the struttingest drum majors that you would ever want. It's just like a show horse going down the field. And everybody was proud to go behind them. Like a football team, not everybody would be a quarterback. So that's, he moved them around where he needed them. And that sound was absolutely great. You know, band, I'll tell you, this band helped me out in the Navy, because all the marching experience I had here slammed right on into the Navy and boot camp. And man, I didn't have any problems at all.
By 1940-41, Mr. Willis's fourth year, the band had over 80 students. Bob Luttrell is seen here, as is Reba Inkelbarger Haynes. Although it was only the 6th year since Malcolm Morrison restarted the group, Mr. Willis set a high goal for the band. In the 1940s, there was a widespread movement to coordinate a national band festival, with regional events held around the country. Mr. Willis took the Central Band to the Richmond Regional Festival in spring 1941. Due to the war, buses were scarce, and money to hire them even scarcer. So,
the parents furnished transportation,
Wow.
to my knowledge. No, back then, nobody had any money. I mean, you know, it was tight.
When we went to Richmond, we went on to Washington, D.C. and enjoyed the sights and sounds. We went in a caravan. We went in automobiles and followed one another all the way, and it was very exciting to meet in that huge building where we met for competition, and to see people from all over the eastern United States competing there and hearing bands the likes of which we'd never heard before. It was a very exciting experience for a high schooler at that time.
The group really looks impressively large in this additional photo from the 1941 annual.
the band again was awarded a superior rating at the East Tennessee Concert Festival that year. At the band room, we have an extensive archive of concert festival judges' sheets, including almost every one from 1959 to the late 90s. There are a few more that seem to be earlier but are undated. I'm convinced that this is the sheet from 1941, when Frank Simon was again retained as the single judge. Interestingly, the organization is listed as the Fountain City High Band from County High School, Fountain City, Tennessee. They received a very respectable 2 or excellent rating at the national contest in Richmond, but Mr. Willis was probably not happy with that result. He and the students continued working to return to the national band contest the next year.
This picture was in the 1942 Centralite, but the band still has a large, framed, hand-colored version.
Here's this hand-colored enlargement in the same spot where it was taken 62 years before. By this 41-42 school year, V.C. Adcock has now transferred to Central from Greenville. Bob Luttrell is still in the band. And we also see freshman clarinet player Paul Sherbakoff. We'll hear more from Mr. Sherbakoff later. This is the band that returned in the spring of 1942 to the National Band Contest, this time at the Nashville Regional. V.C. Adcock told me that due to the war, buses for hire were not available, and with gasoline rationing, parent transportation was limited. So, Miss Gresham found some money, and quite a few of the students were given $2.50 each to ride a Greyhound bus to Nashville to assemble for the contest. This time the band was successful in earning a superior rating. The National Band Contest was suspended due to the war and was not revived later. Central was the only band from Tennessee to ever receive a superior rating at one of these contests. Mr. Willis served as president of ETSBOA from 1942 through 1946, and the association records specifically praise him for almost single-handedly keeping the organization alive during these wartime years. He would also serve 2 more times, 49 to 51 and 59 to 61. This total of 8 years is still unmatched by any other director and indicates the respect which his fellow directors held for him. During the early 1940s, several traditions of the Central Band program began to take shape. Although the band now had an increasing number of women, they still did not march. Various information points to this being a preference of Miss Gresham or of Mr. Willis, although probably it was a combination of both. This practice continued until the late 1960s.
And also, he would not let the girls march. She would not.
Say that originally came from Miss Gresham.
Miss Gresham. Girls should not march. And the girls had skirts, and they would play in the stands at football games, or they would play in the concerts, of course, but they never marched.
Also, at some point in the early 40s, the band was divided into 2 classes. The first band was made up of the best players, as auditioned by Mr. Willis. The second was for younger players as well as upperclassmen who wanted to play, but were not interested to the degree that was required for the top band.
During this period, Mr. Willis was finally able to enlist some help getting students started playing before high school. Evidently, the first example of this was at Fountain City Elementary School, where music teacher Eva Hagler also taught instrumental classes. Later in the decade, Mr. Willis himself went to Fountain City twice per week to work with beginners. A final note about Ms. Hagler: she was also the sister of Nanny Lee Hicks, longtime Central Social Studies teacher and Fountain City historian. The fight song played by Central, Red and Black, was composed by Mr. Willis soon after arriving at Central.
I had orchestra first period when he was writing the song, the Red and Black Pep song, which is still in use today. And he was trying to figure out the last line of words. He had gotten it down to, and we will fight, fight, and he didn't know how to finish it, and so he was running it by us, some of us, and he decided, I think I'll say forevermore for Red and Black.
I think his first residence was on the west end of the bridge at 5th Avenue there. And I played in the neighborhood around there in the summer times, and I remember hearing him, I think he was writing the fight song at the piano at night at his house. And Paul Sherbakoff, I played clarinet. I came over as a freshman in 1941 and tried out with Mr. Willis. We were the wartime class. We came to school in September of '41 and Pearl Harbor in December, so we ended up being here through 4 years of war. I did make, of course, solo clarinet first chair my senior year. I took clarinet from Fred D. Robertus, who was the band director at Knoxville High School. I was probably sitting right about there, first chair clarinet at the center, and the auditorium was full of people, a lot of parents and grandparents and friends, but it was a big deal for us, and it was a marvelous experience to be one of his pupils. I think I would call him a little bit soft-spoken, but I saw the other side of him too. The day I took my music home to practice one night and forgot to bring it back the next morning, so several clarinetists had no music to go on, and I alluded to maybe I had it at home. I didn't admit it right there, but when I brought it in the next morning, he was there and explained to me what I'm supposed to do when I take music home. It was an honor to be band captain. The way we marched, clarinets were in the front and I was right-hand front row. It was one of my great high school experiences knowing O'Dell, or Mr. Willis. I haven't ever called him O'Dell to his face.
The All East Tennessee Band had grown into a weekend band clinic sponsored by the ETSBOA, with continued participation by Central students.
You auditioned and they placed you based on how you did that day wherever in the section they thought you ought to be. It was an honor to be picked at all, and it was a good experience.
So was that something that Mr. Willis just told you about, or did he come to you and say, I think you ought to do this?
He told us we were going. So, yes, sir. But he was almost a perfectionist when it came to being in tune and being technically proficient and able to play it. And so, as a result, I went away to the Navy after I graduated. When I came back, I went over and tried out for the UT band, and some of the numbers they gave me to sight read for my audition, I had played 4 years in Central, so I ended up in a relatively high position for a freshman in the UT band, and I can thank Mr. Willis for that. Yeah, he had a sense of humor, and in fact, he cut an eraser at somebody on the back row one day just to make them shut up. He'd probably get a fine today, wouldn't he?
Yeah, we're not really supposed to do that.
I mean, it was accurate too.
On Easter Sunday, 1945, there was a full-page focus on the Central Band in the Knoxville Journal Cavalcade, a weekly feature section. A variety of photos included individual students, the combined concert bands, the marching band, and this. Dan Kelly watches as Paul Sherbakoff and Hassie Gresham hold the band's 2 plaques from the National Band Contest trips in 1941 and 1942. Miss Gresham would retire only 2 years later, after years of supporting the band and Mr. Willis in all their efforts. There are several errors in the hand-lettered caption. Nevertheless, this photo is one of the band's most prized possessions. The 2 plaques are still proudly displayed today. They, along with one of Mr. Willis's uniforms and several additional trophies, may still be seen in this trophy case in the Central High School Commons.
The 1945-1946 band included Colbert Petrie. Mr. Petrie began playing clarinet at a young age and continued his studies with Eva Hagler at Fountain City Elementary School. By his freshman year at Central, he was already advanced enough to be selected for the first concert band by Mr. Willis. By his senior year, Colbert was drum major, later performed in one of the best Air Force bands in the country in the early 1950s, and was a very successful, highly respected band director at Powell High School and Northwest Middle School.
This was another highly honored band. Details are somewhat sketchy, but with information from Mr. Petrie and from newspaper entries, it seems that each of the 3 divisions of the state sent a representative to a special state concert festival. It's not known exactly how Central was chosen to represent East Tennessee. At any rate, Central was chosen as the best of the bands at the contest, winning the right to play a special performance for the State Educators Conference that year. Colbert Petrie remembers that the Memphis Bartlett Band was very impressive and that the Central students were not optimistic that they had won until the announcements were made. He said that the other group played a very contemporary work and that Mr. Willis's choice, the Holtz Suite in E-flat, may have been a partial factor in the judge's choice of Central as the winner. In 9 years, O'Dell Willis had developed the band from less than 40 members and relative obscurity to over 100 members and being rated the best in the state. Whether he was ready for a different challenge or for personal or financial reasons, he then made a change. Clark & Jones Music Store in downtown Knoxville offered him a managerial position, which he accepted. He spent 3 years with the music store, 1946 through 1949. Perhaps Paul Sherbakoff speaks for many alumni.
I remember when I saw him at Clark & Jones, I was thinking what a waste of talent that was for him to be up there selling music.